Good afternoon. My name is Adisa Griffin, and I'd like to welcome you to today's webinar, part 2 of the Ask the Expert series, Helping Kids with ADHD and LD Overcome Chronic Stress with clinical neuropsychologist Jerome Schulz. This webinar is a continuation of the monthly Ask the Expert series sponsored by the National Resource Center on ADHD, or NRC. The NRC is a partnership between CHAD and the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, and serves as the national clearinghouse for the latest evidence-based information on ADHD. We are also pleased to be joined in partnership for this special Ask the Expert by the Learning Disabilities Association of America, or LDA. LDA is a leading volunteer nonprofit advocating for individuals with learning disabilities around the United States. For those of you who participated in Part 1 on January 16th, thank you for joining us once again. And for those of you joining us for the first time, we are extremely happy to have you and are confident you will learn a great deal from Dr. Schulz today. Of course, if you missed Part 1, you can review the recording at any time by visiting www.help, the number 4, and then adhd.org. In Part 1, Dr. Schulz gave a riveting presentation on the impact of chronic stress on learning and behavior in children with ADHD and LD. And he also described his de-stress model, how his de-stress model can be used to break the cycle of fear, anxiety, stress, and escape that often creates havoc in the lives of these kids. Today, after a brief recap of Part 1, Dr. Schulz will dedicate the remainder of the hour to your questions about these important topics. Dr. Schulz is a faculty member of Harvard Medical School in the Department of Psychiatry, who specializes in the diagnosis and treatment of children and young adults with LD, ADHD, and other special needs. Formerly a middle school special education teacher, Dr. Schulz maintains a private practice in neuropsychology in Lexington, Massachusetts. In addition to his clinical and educational work, Dr. Schulz serves as an international consultant on the issues related to neuropsychology and the appropriate education of children and young adults with special needs. He is also the author of the book Nowhere to Hide: Why Kids with ADHD and LD Hate School and What We Can Do About It. And speaking of this excellent book, Nowhere to Hide, many of you may remember that the NRC announced that a copy of Dr. Schulz's book would be awarded to one lucky webinar participant who completed the evaluation survey after each part of this two-part series. We are very pleased to announce that Jocelyn Axon of Centennial, Colorado, was the winner of our first book drawing. Her name was randomly selected from the completed surveys, so we thank all of you who took the time to provide the valuable feedback that you did, and we congratulate Ms. Axon once again. Keep in mind the second book will be awarded to another lucky person who completes the post-webinar survey for Part 2 as well. So look for the follow-up email with the survey link in your email box about an hour after the close of this webinar. And now, before I turn the presentation over to Dr. Schulz, let me remind everyone that you can submit questions, written questions that is, to Dr. Schulz using the questions pane on your webinar control panel as shown in this slide here. Also, please be aware that all audience participants have been muted, so the only voices you will hear are those of the moderator and our expert. Finally, if you experience any technical problems or miss any portion of the webinar, a recording will be available for both webinars on the NRC's website a few days from now. Actually, Part 1 is already available, and Part 2 should be available a few days after the close of this webinar. Now, without further ado, I am pleased to welcome today's expert, Dr. Jerome Schulz. Just one moment. And Dr. Schulz, if you'd like to begin.
I'm here, Adisa. Thanks for that great introduction, and glad to be back for part 2 of this webinar series. I'm excited about doing part 2 today for a lot of reasons, but last time, if the folks joined me, we didn't have a dialogue. I presented most of the information, and some questions came in afterwards, but I'm looking forward to today because I'll have a chance to talk directly with some of the participants. Last time we went over these topics that you see on the screen in front of you, and I'll give you a brief recap for those of you who weren't able to join us the first time or review the archived version. The seminar last time dealt with why kids with ADHD and learning disability are so subject to the effects of stress. We talked a bit about the neurobiology of stress, and I talked about how stress affects brain function and learning. I introduced and discussed what I call the saving face cycle. That's not a misspelling there. I'll show you the saving face cycle in just a couple of minutes, but I'll explain the reaction that kids have when they're under stress and they can't do anything about it. I also exposed the audience to my de-stress model, which I designed as an easy way to remember how to help kids find greater success and happiness in school and in life in general. We spent a little time last time defining what stress was and differentiating between good stress and bad stress. And we spent a lot of time talking about the impact of stress on life and life in general and learning in particular. So we're going to move ahead to the next slide, and with a reminder that bad stress, or the kind of stress that gets in the way of learning, happens when we don't have a sense of control over things in our environment that we perceive as being threatening. When kids believe that there's something in their environment that they can't handle, that they can't deal with, no matter what we say to them, no matter what words of encouragement they hear from us, they see this as a stress, and their reactions are fairly predictable, and we talked about that last time. And we'll see how this shows up. Next slide, please, Adisa. We need to do a couple of things to make sure that we can help children in schools with learning disabilities and attention deficit disorder deal with this stress. We have to understand, first of all, the relationship between stress and learning and why those two things are very connected. Secondly, we have to understand why kids with LD and ADHD or any combination of those difficulties are particularly vulnerable to stress. We have to correctly interpret behaviors that we see in kids as the consequence of stress and not as bad behavior. And finally, we have to teach kids how to gain a sense of control over their environment through giving them repeated experiences with tasks and activities over which they feel a sense of, in which they feel a sense of competence, because it's only through competence can kids have a sense of being in control of their educational environment. Next slide. The saving face cycle looks something like this. If you look at the top of that circle, you see the word fear in the yellow box. When kids are exposed to a stressor that they worry about, that they think is going to threaten their competence or make them look stupid or dumb or feel stupid or dumb in front of other kids, they respond with fear. The first thing they try to do is avoid that, and we see a lot of avoidance in the cognitive shutting down that kids exhibit from time to time, or the physical desire to escape or flee a situation. But they can't do it. As my book title says, there is nowhere to hide. And as a result of that, these kids are under what you see in the green rectangle there, a fairly chronic degree of stress that goes on and on and on, day after day after day in school. And kids are caught up in this cycle, have to get out of it some way, and what they do is either shut down or close up or act out or act up. They go to the nurse's room, they leave school, they cognitively shut down, they get sick, or they have attendance problems. These kids do whatever they can do and whatever any organism under stress would do to get out of an inescapable situation. They flee or they fight. Let's take a look at the next slide. There is good news, although I said in the presentation last time that this chronic stress has the effect of changing the way the brain functions and even making it less able to learn well, making it less efficient. Well, this isn't a chronic situation. It doesn't need to be a chronic situation. The good news is that we can turn this around. If we teach kids how to understand and manage their own stress, and if we put them in an environment in which they can experience success a lot more than they can experience failure, this can turn the whole cycle around. And kids with learning disabilities and ADHD can become more efficient, more effective, feel better about themselves, learn to like school, and are finally able to feel the joy of success that so many of their classmates feel on a day-to-day basis. Next slide. The de-stress model is just an acronym that I came up with to help us remember the important steps of this. And as a quick recap, the first thing we need to do is understand the condition. Parents and teachers need to understand the condition. And if they don't understand it, they need to sometimes seek an outside evaluation or an in-school evaluation to help them get a better handle on this condition. And as I said last time, one of the most important things that has to happen is that a school and a parent have to be on the same page about understanding this condition. I pointed out before last time, too much time is spent in conflicts about whether or not this is a true diagnosis, how it manifests itself. We have to resolve that very quickly. We then have to educate the child about the impact of this learning disability or ADHD on his or her own learning, and that's a process in and of itself. The first step in the first S in the de-stress model is to speculate, and this really means helping kids look ahead to see what things are going to be difficult and what things are going to be hard for them, and also learning how to analyze their own learning strengths and weaknesses and how to use their strengths and get around or work around their weaknesses. The next letter in the de-stress model is T, and this is the active part of this model that involves teaching kids strategies that allow them to have success, that allow them to use their brain power to work through and work around difficulties when they encounter them, as opposed to shutting down and tuning out. The next letter in the acronym has to do with the R, reducing the threat. We have to create learning environments or materials or activities or use language that help to make kids feel more comfortable. If we say say something to kids like, even as positive as, "This might be difficult, but I think you're going to be able to do it." Well, guess which part of that sentence kids under stress hear? This might be difficult. That's what they'll hear, and that's what they'll respond to. So we really have to be careful about creating an environment that neutralizes the risk for kids. The next letter in the acronym is E, and that has to do with exercise. And I talked about the importance of physical activity as a stress reducer. There's a well-known connection there, and unless kids are physically active, their brains won't work as efficiently, and as a result, they'll be under more stress. The next S in the model is success. We have to work really hard to help kids replace the doubt that they come to school with every day with a sense of confidence that'll help them say yes to the next challenge that we put before them. And finally, the last S in the model is to strategize. We as adults, parents, and teachers have to use what we've learned about these kids' ability to learn, and we have to teach kids how to use those strategies as they move ahead. Next slide.
So, Dr. Schulz, actually, that is the last point of the de-stress model as outlined here. We're actually ready to begin taking questions. Do you have any other thoughts for your intro? I can open it up for questions, or if you would like to say a few more words.
Well, we went through that pretty quickly, and I'm happy about that because I want to save time for question and answers. I know we've got a lot of questions, and people have a lot of questions they want to ask, and I want to make sure that I have the opportunity to ask those. I'm going to try to answer questions in a way that has more applicability to more people. So if some specific questions come in about a child or a classroom, I'll try to answer that in general so that it helps not only the person asking the question, but many other people who are listening today.
Sure. Thank you very much. And again, to our audience, just a reminder, if you can ask questions by typing it in the questions pane of your control panel there. So the first question, Dr. Schulz, is general, but I think in a way that probably reflects a lot of what a lot of parents maybe and professionals may be feeling around this question. And it is, my child has ADHD and LD and a behavioral disorder. Where do I begin? So that big question of where do I start once my child is diagnosed, what happens then?
I think the first thing that a parent has to do faced with the situation that many parents are faced with, that is a complex, multi-layered condition. You have to kind of decide which is the primary difficulty or disability. For kids who have ADHD and learning disabilities, there's an interplay between those two conditions that affect one or the other. Estimates range from 30 to 50% of the population in terms of overlap between those two conditions. And if your child, in addition, has a behavior disorder or exhibits behaviors that present a disorder to his learning or to the classroom, you have to look at that. I think the key is to figure out which one of those is the major impediment. We've got a lot of chicken and egg issues going on here, because sometimes learning disabilities make it difficult to focus and attend. Sometimes attention deficit disorder makes it difficult to learn and creates a look-alike situation that appears like it's a learning disability, but in fact it's fluctuations in attention that are causing the learning problem. Both of those things in combination put kids under stress. They act up, they act in, they exhibit behaviors that are troubling and worrisome to us, and we then may think that that's a behavior disorder. I think it's incumbent upon the parents and the team of people working with the kids to kind of put those three conditions into a pie chart, if you will, and try to decide which at the moment is the target we want to go after. Clearly we're going to address all those issues, but we have to kind of unravel the chicken and the egg issue for kids so that we can set a priority in terms of learning. In most cases, when kids learn to be more successful at school, their behaviors improve and their learning improves. So in most cases where this trio of difficulties exists, I put my money on dealing with the underlying cause of it, and that's fear and shame and self-doubt. And I put this kid in a situation where we give him plenty of the opposite of those things, plenty of success and plenty of opportunities to feel competent.
Thank you very much. The next question that we have, again, is probably one that many parents and adults have related to children with ADHD and learning disabilities. And it's from Kim, and she asks, are there any suggestions to help kids at school when the parent and the child have little control over the school environment, whether that's the class size, I'm assuming the class size, or the attitude of the teachers or other professionals? Any recommendations for what she can do?
It's an excellent question, and the crux of it, I think, has to do with a parent feeling like she or he doesn't have control over the school environment, nor does the child. I think that there are many schools that have engaged parents in a way, not only through the IEP process, which is a kind of a legal process, but philosophically they involve parents in a way that makes them feel like they do have some control over the school. If parents are feeling alienated from the school or feel like the school doesn't know their child very well, I often encourage parents to create a profile, a folder, a file, a dossier on their child, explaining, giving examples in the past of how their child has been successful. Typically what happens is parents come to the schools laden with a wheelbarrow full of material showing what's wrong with their child, because they want the schools to know, because the presumption is that once the school knows what's wrong, they'll do what's right. I'm going to encourage parents to try to turn this around a little bit by showing the school what has been right in the past, how kids have been successful either outside of school, in scouts, in summer camp, when they're with their grandparents. I'd like parents to help schools identify when kids can act in a way that's responsible, respectful, and courageous, and help the school create an environment that duplicates or replicates some of the environments that allow that to happen. In terms of a child being in charge of school, kids can take more charge of their own learning when they understand it more. So when teachers take the time to ask kids how they learn best, when a teacher gives an assignment, for example, the first thing he or she might say to the kids is, before you even begin to work on this assignment, I want you to think about a time when you've had an assignment like this that you've done really well, just like this one. Let's talk about that a little bit. And if a teacher spends a minute in class with kids, having them think about or talk about previous successful experiences, their minds are in a different place when they then put pencil to paper. So teachers can easily give kids more power over their learning by helping engage them cognitively in that way. And I've seen that happen in classes of 30 and 40 kids, depending on a teacher's understanding of the need to do this.
Thank you very much.
I can answer these questions in a very long way because this is how I spend a lot of my time working with teachers and parents talking about these kind of answers. So I'm going to pick a place where I'm going to cut off and let more questions be asked. If we don't get to all these questions, a lot of the questions that may be waiting in the wings might be answered in my book. But there are a lot of good resources, especially the Learning Disabilities Association or the CHAD website, that also give some very good answers to the questions that I'm sure we'll get today.
Thank you very much, Dr. Schulz. The next question speaks to the issue of actual stress management, and in part one, you suggested that reducing threats and managing stress is an important component of managing ADHD and learning disabilities. So Diamond asked, can you recommend any age-appropriate stress management tools or techniques that might help a child?
It's a good question, and it's important to differentiate the kind of stress that we're all under, kind of the generalized stress that gets in our way, and then the specific stress that my presentation and my book talks about more. That is the stress that's caused by being not in control of the situation. And I think it's important to differentiate those two things, because there are kids who can try to get more control over their environment, can understand their learning disability or their ADHD and how that impacts learning, but they still might be kids who are high-strung or wired for anxiety. We're seeing an increase in anxiety symptoms in kids across all the schools in which I work, and I hear this from people all over the country when I do presentations. There's a lot of worry about worry, if I can say that. I think things that help all people deal with stress can be used in a developmentally appropriate manner. That's exercise number one. That's easy to do. Getting physical exercise is important. And I would say get physical exercise unless your child is a competitive athlete or can compete with other kids. I'd stress exercise that's a solo exercise, swimming or long-distance running or boating or canoeing or bowling or things like that that don't put a child with, let's say, directionality problems or gross motor coordination problems in competition with other kids who are going to literally run circles around them. So exercise that a child can do well, and enjoy. Bike riding around the neighborhood with a parent or another kid is as good as anything else. Nutrition is really important, and that's something we do have control over. If kids don't drink enough liquids during the day, water during the day, their brain cells and their body cells are depleted. They don't have enough nutrition, the right kinds of food to give their brains the fuel they need to process well. That adds to stress. Sleep is probably one of the biggest culprits that we have to look at. If kids are going to bed late or they're staying up late, whether they're watching TV or they're filled with anxious fears or they're playing screen games, they need to go to bed at a reasonable amount of time. And kids need to get 7 or 8 hours worth of sleep a night, good sleep a night, not interrupted sleep, not sleep that's interrupted by the noise of a household or by lights coming through the windows too early in the morning. If we can do whatever we can do to get kids more rested, their stress levels will go down. So sleep, nutrition, exercise, other things that help relax the brain, like yoga, deep breathing exercises, teaching a kid self-hypnosis. And that sounds a little mystical, but you can teach kids to be more reflective and more mindful and be more aware of their breathing and their heart rate and their skin temperatures at a very early age. A lot of kindergarten classes, even preschools that I know of, kids, teachers are starting the day and with yoga exercises and stretching exercises and talking to kids about the idea of what stress feels like. A lot of the kids that we're talking about, whether because they're young or they don't read their body sensations well, don't understand what it means to be under stress. So they have to be taught about the feelings that represent stress, and only when they're taught about those feelings, about the way they're breathing, about the way their body's feeling, can they do anything about it. So I think there's there are a lot of things that don't take a lot of time, don't take a lot of money, don't really take a lot of energy, and are good for the entire family that I'd encourage families to do. If you're not sure about which activities would be good at which developmental levels, a classroom teacher is a good source, or the guidance counselor in your child's school is a good source of information about de-stressing activities for kids.
Thank you, Dr. Schulz. The next question comes from Laura, and it's actually, I think it's a great question. She asks, when, if ever, is it appropriate to mete out consequences after an unwanted behavior, even if it's a maladaptive response to stress?
Laura, that's an excellent question, because sometimes we get, as people in special education, we get accused of being soft on kids and not giving them consequences. I think it's really important to differentiate the behavior from the cause of the behavior. If the behavior is caused by stress, that is, kids act out and act up or become aggressive because they're under stress, there always has to be some kind of consequence for that. And the consequence doesn't mean getting stuck in a corner or being yelled at or being punished. The consequence means that behavior, Johnny, is the consequence may just be saying to a child, Johnny, that behavior is unacceptable. I understand that you're upset, and I understand that this is something that you do sometimes when you're upset, but that behavior has three consequences, and I'm speaking in many more words than I typically use with a child, but that behavior gets in the way of your learning, that behavior gets in the way of other kids' learning, and that behavior gets in the way of my teaching, and that behavior gets in the way of the safety of the classroom. Therefore, Johnny, it has to stop. If you can stop it yourself and gain self-control, that'd be wonderful. If you can't, I'm going to help you do that. And that means we might take a walk around the building. That might mean we might put on headphones and listen to music. That might mean you go to the self-calming box in the room if you're a preschool, kindergarten, elementary school child, and get out one of those toys or tools that helps you relax. But I think it's really important for people to be honest about this. You can't allow these behaviors to go on day after day. You can understand them, but you can't tolerate them all the time because they are disruptive to learning. So I think every behavior ought to have some kind of consequence, and the consequence ought to be matched to the let's say the size of the infraction. You know, if a child does something dangerous and hurts another child, he has to apologize for it. The other child has to be made physically safe and psychologically safe. That might require a timeout to think and calm down and make a commitment to coming back into a classroom or program might be a part of that. I think the big mistake is punishing kids in a punitive way every time a child does something like this, and it just creates a cycle that isn't getting the child where we want him to go. I'm going to stop there and see if there are other questions that are coming up or any that are related to this one. I've got a lot to say about that, but I want to keep the ball moving here.
Great, thank you. There is actually, the next question is related, and it's how can parents, teachers, and other adults remember to consider the underlying cause of unwanted behaviors due to stress in ADHD and LD? After all, the behavior can cause stress in parents who may not remember to respond with the child's disability in mind. Is that a good question for you? Is that okay?
It's a great question, and you know what? We're human beings. We don't always respond in the way that a textbook or a psychologist might tell us to respond. I know I don't. I've got children and grandchildren, and you know, I know all about this stuff, but sometimes in the heat of a moment or in a stressful moment in my own life or in the family life, I might not respond in a way that other people would judge to be the very best way to do it. But the point is, if you try to do it, if you're conscious of it, and you're aware that you should do it, and when you do it, it has a good payoff. That's really what I would hope that you as parents and what teachers would do as well. What happens often is parents lose their cool, lose their temper, look really mad or mean or scary to their kids at a moment when their kids can handle it not very well at all. And so here's a time when kids need to have you be a rock in the middle of a stormy place for them, and because you're a human being, it may not happen. I would just say try to minimize those times. If you find you're responding to kids by yelling and screaming and you're always at your wit's end, get some professional help to deal with this. Get somebody to talk to you about how to break that cycle. Clearly it's stressful, it's frustrating. You've got a kid with mild to moderate special needs having difficulty all the time. There are a lot of things that are going on in your family, everybody's family. It's hard to keep all these balls in the air at one time. The point is always think about what you've done and And then don't try to excuse it. I mean, you can say, Johnny, I'm sorry that I blew up, and I know that's not helpful, and I'll try next time to do a better job. But you can't say that every time you blow up unless there are interludes between those blow-ups that are calm and peaceful. So I would say to parents who are under stress, do some of those stress-busting things that I talked about earlier about kids for yourself, even for moments of time, so you can pull yourself together. Kids need that from us. So let me stop and see if I've adequately answered that. I won't know if I've adequately answered that question. I can't hear what you're saying, but Adisa is going to help me by asking another question for me.
I will. And in your answer, you actually mentioned that if a parent feels like they need help, they should, it's a good idea to seek out a professional. So the next question is related to that, and it comes from Katie, and she asks, how does one find a team of professionals who gets it? I found that many psychologists, pediatricians, teachers, and so forth do not understand ADHD adequately. Those who may have the knowledge and experience to help a child cope with chronic stress are usually unaffordable for many families. Affordability and accessibility are obstacles that need to be addressed. Do you have any recommendations for dealing with these issues? It's a big question, I know, but I think it's a good one to get your insight on.
Yeah, it's a very good question. First thing I want to say is that if you're a parent seeking out professional help, it is typically an expensive proposition. I'll talk about ways to get help without having it be so expensive in just a minute, but remember that you have the right and the responsibility to talk to a clinician, either by a telephone appointment or an initial visit, even if you have to pay for it with that person, to ask him or her what his experience has been with kids with learning disabilities or ADHD, what their approach is, what strategies they use, and most importantly, how effective their interventions are. This is a consumer-oriented age that we're living in, and doctors, psychologists, social workers, mental health workers really expect to be asked that question. And it's important to ask it and expect an answer. You may be working with a younger clinician who hasn't had as much experience as someone who's been in the field for a long time, but that person might have just the right kind of energy and attitude and spirit to work with your child and you as a family. There's also an issue of whether or not the therapist or counselor or helping person is going to be working with a child or the family. It's hard for me to imagine these problems being isolated at the level of a child. I think the most effective treatments that I know I've provided over the years are treatments that provide service to a child but also include the family, because this child is not the cause of the problem. The child has a problem that affects a lot of people around him or her. So again, just to recap, ask for other people if they've had experience with these clinicians. Ask the clinician themselves what their experience has been. Present to them a hypothetical or a real situation that you've been dealing with, and see how they'd respond to it, and push for details. That's okay to do. It's an expensive proposition. You wouldn't buy a new car without taking it out for a test drive, and you want to do the same thing with a therapist. And if it doesn't work, feel okay saying to that person, I'm sorry, you seem like a nice enough person, but I don't think your approach matches our needs. Thanks for your time, and we're gonna think about this and look around a little bit, and do just that. Don't walk away from therapy because you had one experience that didn't feel right with one person. There are lots of wonderful people out there who provide a lot of help to children and families. The other thing I would do is ask school guidance staff about people they've worked with who have been really helpful and who communicate well with the school, because it's important, if your child is in outside therapy, outside of school, that there's a bridge that's built between the home, the therapist, and the school. When those three parts don't happen in a collaborative fashion, kids get less well served. So I want to encourage you to do that. In terms of the expense of services, some therapists may say, well, it's my traditional approach to see kids every week. Some parents say twice a week. Well, some kids need therapy with that level of intensity. Other kids, because of your financial situation, might be able to be supported by therapy or counseling every other week or less frequently. I would give the therapist the time in the beginning to work weekly with your child if that's their mode, because it helps build up some momentum and helps relationships develop. And once that happens, you can taper off a little bit. Your kids have busy lives, you have busy lives. Sometimes weekly therapy is a big intrusion on the normal life cycle that you live. Using school guidance staff, social workers, guidance counselors, school adjustment counselors to their fullest extent of their availability and their skill is really important too. These people are well-trained, well-meaning, and usually nice people go into mental health. So if you let them help you and you're able to let them know what your worries are and give them a chance to respond to those, you can develop a relationship that can last over several years for a child in school and will really cost you nothing except the time it takes to relate to those professionals. There are also self-help groups. CHAD has parent-to-parent training sessions. The Learning Disabilities of America site has resources for parents and that can be very helpful in terms of management. There are a lot of things. There are a lot of resources online, and some parents may feel like they're overwhelmed by the amount of information. But if you stick to reputable sources and don't be tempted to stray into the kind of the never land of the non-recognized agencies that have been around for a long time serving kids like we were talking about, you should be okay. So let me stop there.
Thank you, Dr. Schulz. And if I may add, just briefly, you mentioned CHAD and the Learning Disability Association's resources. I'd also like to point out that CHAD does have a professional directory at www.chadd.org under Finding Support, and also the National Resource Center's Hospital and University ADHD Center directory is an excellent resource as well. So to our audience, please do go to www.help4ADHD.org or call one of our representatives here at the National Resource Center, and I will show the number in just a little while. The next question, Dr. Schulz, is a good general question. I think it's what role does medication have in addressing ADHD? And maybe, I don't know your thoughts on learning disabilities as well as it relates to chronic stress and managing the impact of those disorders.
I have to answer this question in the context of the reality that I'm not a physician. I don't prescribe medications. As a clinical neuropsychologist, I need to know something about medications. But it's been my experience over the past 35 or 37 years of my clinical practice that medication has been a very helpful tool in the management of ADD or ADHD when it exhibits a significant impediment in the lives of kids. I am not an advocate for using medication as a solo means of trying to fix a problem, and I think the audience understands that quite well. But when and I am also an advocate of doing everything you can first that's reasonable before attempting medication to help a child gain a greater sense of self-control. The stress management, self-control strategies that I talked about earlier can be helpful. Making sure that the situation at school is the most conducive it can be to learning for most kids, that there are clear rules, clear expectations. If a classroom or a school is chaotic, it's kind of hard to imagine a child who's all over the place functioning well in that environment. So medication is not a solution to a chaotic classroom or a disorganized teacher. That may require a talk with a building principal to talk about switching teachers the next year, so your child, or switching teachers in the middle of the year, so that your child has what he or she needs in terms of an environment that's predictable and calm and controlled. Because otherwise you see some of the symptoms you see in some kids, some of the behaviors you see in some kids are consequences of being in an environment that's unpredictable. So I'm straying from the medication issue a little bit, but unless everything else that can be done that doesn't involve medication is done and done fairly quickly and is evaluated for its effectiveness, then I don't think you should move to medication too quickly. I know a lot of parents have concerns and questions about the safety of medications. Those are questions that have to be asked of your pediatrician. You have to do some reading about those. I have never in all my years seen a negative reaction to medication that wasn't fixed by stopping the medication under the good guidance of a good qualified psychiatrist or pediatrician. I've never seen a situation where medication, when it's been appropriately diagnosed and dosed, and that's an important piece, has been harmful to a child. And I've seen lots and lots of kids. I'm in lots and lots of schools. That said, I absolutely respect the parents' desire to stay away from medications if they have concerns about the safety factors. But I think that to not consider medication in a child when you've manipulated or managed all those things I talked about before, the home environment, the school environment, the regularity of a child's schedule, if you've done all those things and you've done them fairly well, and the child is still having difficulty navigating or living in that world that you've created and made better for him, then I would certainly consider medication as a possibility. A short-term dose of the appropriate medication administered by a physician who has experience doing this, and in a situation where the school is giving feedback to the pediatrician or the psychiatrist about the effects of the medication, something that does not happen often enough, then I think you're missing an opportunity to help a child. When you can meet all those conditions, then you're taking advantage of an opportunity to help a child in a really significant way. And it doesn't have to be forever. You want kids to be accessible to learning. You want kids to feel like they're in charge of their bodies and their minds, and sometimes a little bit of medication for a short amount of time can help that happen, so the child can finally get to the point where he or she has the peace of mind, if you will, to learn the self-control strategies that he's not able to learn while he's in that state of mental chaos. Adisa, I think there was another part to that question, but I talked too long and forgot it.
Let's see. No, it was just the medication in general as a tool for addressing.
Oh, I know what it was.
So go ahead.
You asked me about learning disabilities. There's
Yes.
no medication for learning disabilities. If a child has learning disabilities and ADHD and the medication can help quell the ADHD, then the learning disabilities may not be as severe because the child can now focus attention in those areas in which he or she has difficulty. If the child has either ADHD or learning disabilities and also has anxiety, again, you have to decide if anxiety is the primary disability or difficulty, and in some cases treating the anxiety may help a child become more relaxed, so he or she learns more efficiently. The learning disability doesn't look as severe, and the ADHD quiets down and doesn't look quite as severe because the anxiety that's there has been softened a bit by the use of medication and or therapy.
Thank you very much, Dr. Schulz. I'm going to ask two questions that come from two different people, but I think they are related. I'll ask the first one. It comes from Christy. You mentioned continuous stress raises cortisol levels. Can continued production of cortisol be a health risk for my child? So that's the first question. It's the dangers of continued hormonal or cortisol production. And the second question it comes from Nora, and I think it's related again. It's what are some good age-appropriate models for teaching kids about stress, the brain, and their disability? So it's related in that, as you mentioned, if the child is able to understand what's going on with them and advocate for themselves, they are actually helping reverse some of the damages done by stress.
Right. Yeah, I think they are related questions, and it's good to pair them together. Christy's question about the negative effects of the ongoing production of too much cortisol. Clearly, it can be harmful to a child, both in terms of the neurobiology and the physical reactions to stress that a child is having. If the cortisol production cycle, the stress cycle gets disrupted in a way in which the feedback between the organisms in the brain and the body that are responsible for regulating stress, if those get out of whack and cortisol production is too high, the body and the brain have a wonderful, miraculous capacity to adjust itself to respond to that. But what happens is when they do that by turning down the worry quotient. They say, well, that's not really a big a deal. The brain is saying to the body, that's not really as big a stressor as you think it is, so we're going to shut ourselves down a little bit. That's not a good reaction. There needs to be a healthy, content balance between stress and cortisol. And if the system gets out of whack because the stress is unabated, that's unhealthy physiologically for kids. You can, as I said in the presentation, you can turn that around once you recognize the fact that stress is too high in kids, and you understand that in some kids teaching them to have a sense of competence over their environment can reduce stress. You can turn this cycle around. I think you can start talking to kids about differences in learning style very early in life. Preschoolers can be taught about the way they think, and a parent can say to a preschooler, you're really solving that problem really quickly. You might just want to slow it down a little bit, and if you can, you might be surprised what happens. And so a parent can use language and modeling of a very young child to reflect the learning approach a child is using and modify it or suggest a modification that might have a bigger payoff. But that's not like saying to a preschool child, oh my goodness, you have attention deficit hyperactivity disorder and you need to get a grip. It's really an opportunity to observe behaviors that are in fact getting in the way of normal development and normal learning, and being able to comment on those to a child and model a different approach. As kids get older, you can have units in school about learning differences and learning disabilities and even attention deficit hyperactivity disorder as part of science lessons. So kids then can be encouraged to think about whether or not they have impediments to their own learning that are caused by difficulties in perception that might be a part of a learning disability, or that might have difficulties in learning that are related to difficulties in attention and focusing. But I think that you don't necessarily have to use the labels, and I know there are a lot of people who are concerned about the use of the label, the disability label inherent in the learning disability terminology, and people choose to talk about learning differences, and I think that's fine for a child who might be upset by it. But then there comes a time when you may want to send a child to, let's say, the children's part of the LDA site, Learning Disabilities of America, and those clubs have names for a reason. The condition is called learning disability or learning disorder. So I think it's important to be honest about that. All of us have learning differences. Some of those learning differences are so severe and so and create so much of an impediment that they may be considered a disability at that time. But that's a semantic issue that you have to deal with. But at any rate, I think the more kids understand how they learn, when they do things well, why they did them well, when they do things that they didn't think were as good as they could have done, to help kids understand what they could have done a little bit differently to make the outcome happen in a better way. Having those discussions about the process that kids use so that they can be encouraged to try another process that might be more effective, I think is the pathway to a greater sense of self-understanding in kids. On the other end of the developmental continuum, it's wonderful when you see a kid who's heading off to college who has a history of a learning disability, writing about his or her learning disability in a college application essay and talking about how through self-understanding he began to conquer his stress and subdue his stress, and then learn strategies that allowed him or her to be as successful as they are at that moment in time. That's a letter that a college likes to hear from a kid. I mean, there are a lot of kids in the world with ADHD and learning disabilities, and some of those kids, many of those kids, effectively manage those conditions so they can be very, very successful in a highly competitive environment. And the question is, how do you do that? And if kids can articulate how they do that, that's the ticket of admission to a very successful future.
Thank you, Dr. Schulz. We have about a little over 10 minutes left. And probably about 7 minutes for questions. So I'm going to ask two questions again. The first has to do with rewards as an incentive for helping students or children with learning disabilities or ADHD do their homework or what have you, or their other assignments. And the second has to do with technology, assistive technology. And the questioner would like to get your thoughts on how it can help a child with learning disabilities or ADHD.
Okay, I think the first question was about rewards or reinforcements. I mean, most of us don't work for nothing. Some of us have the luxury of doing that. The payoff for a lot of kids in school for working hard is the feeling of success that they have from doing that work well and getting the praise of their parents, the praise of their teachers, the admiration and the respect of their classmates. If you think about a child with learning disabilities or significant ADHD who doesn't have those successful experiences all the time, you might need to do something to sweeten the pot. Usually when kids with a long history of LD and ADHD do things in school and they do things well, they know that the next thing that will happen to them is they're going to get more work to do. So there's almost sometimes a disincentive to do well because it's safe just to stay in academic neutral some of the time, although you don't move very far in terms of your academic progress. I think the judicious use of reinforcements for kids to help them take that next difficult step is not a bad idea. I think what happens that's unfortunate is that some kids learn very quickly not to do any kind of work without any kind of payoff. And in some families, in some situations, that payoff is enormous. It totally lacks any kind of relationship between the intensity of the task. So if a child says, well, yes, I'll read that chapter in my book tonight, but I get another Lego set or I get another video game for my Xbox, that situation gets out of whack very quickly. What I would say to parents who are thinking about using reward or reinforcement systems is to say to a child, how much more work do you think you could do tomorrow if you got one of the things on your reward list? And the reward list implies that you sit down with the child saying, well, what are some incentives? If you're down and you need a little more reinforcement to get yourself going, what are some things you'd put on that list that might get you going a little bit more? It might get you over a hurdle. So you give a child a chance to put down a whole list of things. It might range from a new computer to I want to say something simple, a new coloring book or something like that. Then a parent has the opportunity to say, well, let's draw a line here. These things below the line are quite possible that we could provide as incentives if you need them. But the ones above the list, like an Xbox 360 or something, they're not going to happen. You may want to put those on your Christmas or your Hanukkah list, but they're not going to happen because you do your homework, because that's abnormal. You don't need to say that, but that's my feeling about it. And then you can say to a child, look, you've got a homework challenge. How big is that challenge on a scale of 1 to 5? Now, that assumes you've practiced this 1 to 5 scale. If the child says to you, that's a 5, no way, Mom and Dad, can I do that? And you say, well, if you pick one of the things from your incentive list, do you think you could get it down to a 3 level of difficulty? And the child says, yeah, maybe I could. In that situation, maybe you want to use a reinforcer. You don't want to get into a habit of doing it. You want to get the kid to be successful and competent so he or she can have that sense of reward that other kids have. That's the goal, not paying him off with prizes and trinkets for doing what's expected in a normal day. The question about assistive technology, another excellent question. Every opportunity has to be used to give kids the assistive technology they need so that their brains, their smart little brains, can access the materials and the tasks that we put before them. If assistive technology, whether that means a math reinforcement activity or a learning software that helps them read better or hear books read to them, whatever it takes. If kids can get access to curriculum and feel successful doing it through assistive technology, it must be provided. In this day and age, there's very little excuse. Certainly these things cost money, but most schools have an abundance of technological resource. Most schools in America have materials available, or if they're not available, they can be borrowed from another school system. An appeal can be made to the material producers for an individual child. There are a lot of things you can do, but assistive technology should be used whenever it can help a child have access to a curriculum which he or she would otherwise find very challenging using traditional media like print or like writing. So I'm going to stop there because I know we're running short on time, but let's see how we are with that.
Sure. Thank you very much. We do have time for one last question, and this question comes from Mary. And she says that in the de-stress model, can you give an example of teaching strategies that maximize success? I believe she's referring to the T in the de-stress model.
Adisa, can you read the last part of that? I missed what you said in the last part of that.
Yes, I'm sorry. In the de-stress model, can you give an example of teaching strategies that maximize success? And I believe Mary is referring to the T in your de-stress model. Is that clear? Is that the?
Yeah, I think let me rephrase what I think I heard you say. That how do you teach children the strategies that lead or to that maximize success? Right?
Yes, I think she's asking for an example of what the T and the de-stress model teach strategies that maximize success how it would apply to her situation or to in general.
Okay. So the teach part of the model means that once you understand a child's learning disability or difficulty, and once the child understands the difficulty or disability, you have to teach the child ways to move through the difficulty or around it. In terms of assistive technology, the teaching may be, well, if you can't read that material yourself at grade level, and you need to read it for a homework assignment, I'm going to teach you how to use this computer software that will read that text to you so you can listen with your very effective ears and very effective listening brain to get that information that you might not get through your eyes. So the teaching part of the teaching model may also be for a child who's under stress, for example. You might say, look, whenever I give you a worksheet that's filled with more than 10 math problems, I get a reaction from you that says, I'm not going to do this. This is stupid. This is dumb. And we've talked about this, Sally. This is you under stress. And Sally smiles, and because you've had this discussion before, and she said, you're right. I'm going to teach you a strategy, two strategies that you're going to use when you're under stress. We're going to take this worksheet, and you're going to look at it. And if your brain is saying to you, oh, teacher, this is way too difficult for me, even though you know and I know that the problems that are contained on this worksheet are not too difficult, the strategy is just simply to fold your paper in half or fold it in quarters, or to have your teacher present these math problems to you on 3x5 cards one at a time or on a computer screen one at a time, so that you look at them and you say, well, I know how to do that. So you reduce the threat of the activity by presenting it simply in a different way. Same material, same level of difficulty, but a different mode of presentation. I think the teach model really, for me, in terms of stress and dealing with stress, has to do with teaching kids ways to listen to what their brain is saying to them when they encounter an activity that in reality or in their perception is too hard for them. And once you get them to be able to tell you and then ultimately tell themselves what their brain is saying, they can create an alternative message to tell their brain to do something else. I just read an article that said if people are trying to go on a diet, to say, I can't eat chocolate is less effective than saying, I won't eat chocolate. Just the way that you use words to tell your brains what it's going to do can be helpful. So the teach part of the model means finding out where the impediment is, finding out what the child is saying to herself about that impediment, teaching the child a different way to approach the task, or teaching the child something else to say to herself that guides the brain in a more positive, success-oriented fashion. I hope that answer was helpful. I realize it was a bit generalized, and it's hard to respond without a specific problem that I'm dealing with, but I hope that answer was helpful to people listening.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Schulz. Sadly, we have come to our last question. I would like to thank you on behalf of the National Resource Center, CHAD, and the Learning Disability Association of America, and all of our audience participants for sharing your insight and experience with us on these last two webinars. And to our audience, please remember to complete the post-webinar survey that will arrive in your email box probably within an hour or so after the close of this webinar. And by doing so, you will also be entered into the final drawing for the signed copy, autographed copy of Dr. Schulz's Nowhere to Hide. And finally, if you would like to watch the recording of Part 1 and 2 of this series, Helping Kids with ADHD and LD Overcome Chronic Stress, you can do so by going to www.help, the number 4, and ADHD.org. That's help for the number 4 ADHD.org. Part 1 is already posted, and Part 2 will be available within a few days. Thank you again for joining us. And Dr. Schulz, once again, thank you very much. This concludes our webinar, and we wish everyone to have a wonderful day.
Thank you, Adisa. Bye-bye.
You're welcome. Take care.